Try and keep warm, son. We'll check that dressing again in the morning.
Thank you, Doctor.
This section on water purification is critical for the Eastern Front.
Indeed, the procedures must be strictly followed.
The war before the war inside the body. Long before the first German tank crossed into Poland, another war had already been studied, cataloged, and quietly feared by military planners across Europe. It was the war against disease. The First World War had offered a brutal education. On the Western Front, more soldiers were hospitalized by illness than by bullets. Trench foot, dysentery, influenza, lice-borne typhus. These were not side effects of combat. They were strategic threats. Entire offensives stalled because armies could not keep their men physically functional. By 1918, every major power understood the lesson. Modern warfare demanded modern hygiene, clean water systems, regular bathing, clothing rotation, delousing, soap, not as comfort, but as equipment. The Allied powers took that lesson seriously. The British Army emerged from the Great War with a professionalized medical corps and a doctrine that treated sanitation as logistics. American planners went further. When the U.S. Army expanded in the late 1930s, hygiene was written directly into training manuals. Soldiers were drilled on washing routines with the same discipline as weapons maintenance. Soap rations were standardized. Mobile bath units were designed before some weapon systems were even finalized. Germany, too, had learned these lessons, at least on paper. The Reich inherited a sophisticated medical tradition. German bacteriologists and public health experts were among the best in the world. During the interwar years, the Reichswehr studied epidemiology closely, aware that future wars would not be fought only with steel and fuel. But doctrine and belief are not the same thing. As the Nazi regime reshaped the German military, priorities shifted. Speed became doctrine. Shock became strategy. The future war was imagined as fast, decisive, and short. There would be no trenches, no stalemates, no prolonged exposure to filth or cold. Blitzkrieg would end wars before disease could take hold. This assumption quietly downgraded sanitation. When resources were allocated, soap factories competed with armaments. Trains that could have carried hygiene supplies carried ammunition instead. Field hygiene units existed, but in reduced numbers. Delousing stations were planned for rear areas, not for rapidly advancing fronts. The German soldier was expected to move forward continuously, too fast to rot. Ideology reinforced this confidence. Nazi racial doctrine imagined the German body as resilient, disciplined, superior. Illness was framed as weakness. Disease, in propaganda belonged to the degenerate or the defeated. Cleanliness was spoken of as a racial trait rather than a logistical requirement. This belief would prove catastrophic. In 1939 and 1940, the early campaigns seemed to validate German assumptions. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in 6. Short campaigns, limited exposure. Soldiers rotated through barracks and captured infrastructure. Soap shortages were inconvenient, not lethal. Disease rates remained manageable. The illusion held. But as Germany's ambitions expanded, the geography changed. The distances stretched. The climates hardened. And the wars ceased to be fast. By the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa opened a front unlike anything the German army had prepared for. Vast spaces, primitive infrastructure, extreme weather, civilian populations already weakened by poverty and previous epidemics. And inside those environments, an ancient enemy was waiting patiently, one that did not need factories, fuel, or ideology to fight. It only needed time, bodies, and the absence of soap. That absence would soon become impossible to ignore. The Eastern Front and the collapse of cleanliness. By the time German forces pushed deep into the Soviet Union in late 1941, the war had stretched far beyond the assumptions that shaped it. Roads dissolved into mud. Rail lines lagged behind the front. Supply convoys broke down under distance, weather, and partisan attacks. What arrived at the front were shells and fuel, barely enough of either. What did not arrive were replacements, winter clothing, and the most mundane of necessities. Soap. The Eastern Front was not merely vast. It was biologically hostile. Entire regions had been chronic breeding grounds for epidemic disease for centuries. Typhus, spread by body lice, had ravaged armies there since Napoleon. Soviet public health systems, already strained before the invasion, collapsed under displacement and destruction. Refugees, prisoners of war, and occupying troops lived in close proximity, sharing lice as easily as air. German soldiers entered this environment with uniforms they could not wash and bodies they could not properly clean. Water sources were frozen or contaminated. Bathhouses were destroyed or inaccessible. Delousing stations, when they existed, were overwhelmed by the scale of the army. Chemical delousing powders ran out. Replacement clothing arrived sporadically or not at all. Medical officers began reporting alarming trends. By autumn 1941, German Army Group Center documented rising cases of lice infestation across frontline divisions. Scratching turned to infection. Infection turned to fever. Fever turned to collapse. Typhus followed predictable lines, first among rear units and prisoners, then creeping toward combat troops. The Wehrmacht had medical knowledge. What it lacked was material. So production inside Germany was falling. Fat and oil, essential for soap, were diverted to food and industrial uses. Synthetic substitutes existed, but output could not match demand. Civilian shortages were already severe. Military allocations shrank as the war economy strained under bombing and blockade. Meanwhile, Allied armies were moving in the opposite direction. In Britain and the United States, soap was classified as essential war material. Factories expanded, not contracted. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps distributed millions of bars monthly. Mobile shower units followed divisions. Delousing was routine, enforced, non-negotiable. The contrast was not accidental. Allied planners viewed disease as a strategic threat equal to enemy fire. German planners increasingly treated it as an unfortunate inevitability. The consequences were measurable. During the winter of 1941 to 42, some German units reported more men incapacitated by illness than by Soviet action. Typhus outbreaks forced temporary withdrawals. Entire companies were quarantined. Combat readiness declined even where ammunition was sufficient. The irony was cruel. Nazi ideology obsessed over racial hygiene, yet failed at literal hygiene. Camps, ghettos, and occupied towns became epidemic reservoirs. German troops, tasked with guarding or administering them, were exposed daily. Fear of disease spread through command structures. Orders were issued to isolate infected civilians, not to supply troops with soap. Disease was not just weakening the army. It was reshaping decision-making. As 1942 unfolded, German commanders began to recognize that the war was no longer being fought only at the front. It was being fought in seams of uniforms, in shared blankets, in bodies that could no longer endure. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the realization took hold that something as small as a bar of soap could halt an advance faster than enemy resistance. That realization would fracture morale, doctrine, and control. And it opens the door to viewing this war from multiple angles at once. Bodies, doctors, and the enemy within. Human angle, the soldier's body. The German infantryman on the Eastern Front did not collapse all at once. He eroded. Days without washing became weeks. While uniforms stiffened with sweat and grime, seems alive with lice. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by scratching that drew blood in the dark. Small cuts festered. Skin infections spread beneath layers that could not be removed in sub-zero temperatures. This was not weakness. It was exposure. Men who had marched hundreds of kilometers began to slow, not from hunger alone, but from exhaustion compounded by illness. Fever drained strength more thoroughly than cold. Typhus did not strike dramatically. It hollowed soldiers out. First confusion, then shaking chills, then silence. Letters home changed tone. Complaints about mud and cold gave way to fear of sickness. Veterans who had survived artillery barges spoke quietly of disease with a different dread. Shellfire was random. Typhus was intimate. Medical angle, doctors at the edge. German military doctors understood exactly what was happening. Their reports were clinical and increasingly desperate. Lice infestation rates rose beyond manageable levels. Delousing capacity was insufficient. Soap shortages were noted repeatedly. Requests were forwarded up the chain, often unanswered. Doctors faced impossible choices: isolate the sick and lose manpower, or keep them in line and risk outbreak. Quarantine units meant weakening fronts already stretched thin. Ignoring disease meant eventual collapse. Some medical officers attempted improvisation: boiling uniforms, makeshift bathing, rationing soap fragments. But without systemic support, these efforts barely slowed the spread. The war had outpaced medicine. Enemy angle. Fear inside the Wehrmacht. Disease did something the Red Army often could not. It frightened German command. Typhus carried historical memory. Napoleon's Grand Army had been destroyed by it. German officers knew the precedent. When outbreaks appeared, panic traveled faster than paperwork. Units were labeled unclean. Transfers were delayed. Entire formations were avoided. The enemy was no longer just across the line. It was inside the army itself. And unlike tanks or infantry, it could not be outmaneuvered. This fear reshaped priorities, even as the war demanded more aggression. It created tension between what commanders wanted to do and what their troops could physically endure. That tension becomes even clearer when viewed through technology, leadership, and moral contradiction, angles that widen the picture beyond the front line. Industry, command, and the irony of control. Technological angle. Soap as industrial power. Soap is not simple in wartime. It requires fats, oils, chemicals, transport, packaging, and time. In total war, each of those inputs competes with something else: food rations, lubricants, explosives, fuel. Germany's war economy, increasingly centralized and bombed, struggled to balance these demands. As Allied bombing intensified, German chemical plants prioritized synthetic fuel and rubber. Soap substitutes were produced, but in insufficient quantities and often of poor quality. Distribution faltered. Frontline units waited weeks for resupply that never came. The Allies faced the same constraints and made different choices. In the United States, industrial scale solved the problem. Soap production was standardized, protected, and prioritized. By 1943, American forces operated mobile bath and laundry units capable of processing thousands of men daily. Delousing was mechanized. Clothing was rotated systematically. This was not comfort. It was combat efficiency. Leadership angle. Decisions at the top. German leadership recognized the issue, but too late and without unity. Some commanders demanded better hygiene support. Others dismissed disease as secondary to combat. Hitler himself fixated on territory and willpower. Illness did not fit his worldview. Reports that blamed logistics rather than morale were often ignored or downplayed. The result was fragmentation. Medical warnings competed with operational urgency. Soap remained low on priority lists, even as divisions reported declining readiness. Allied leadership institutionalized the opposite mindset. Disease prevention was centralized, enforced, and measured. Commanders were held accountable for sanitation failures. Hygiene was treated as discipline. One side planned for the body. The other demanded it endure. Moral irony angle, racial hygiene versus reality. Perhaps the sharpest contradiction lay in ideology. Nazi doctrine preached biological superiority and racial cleanliness. Entire populations were dehumanized under the language of disease. Ghettos and camps were described as necessary sanitary measures. Yet German soldiers guarding these spaces faced uncontrolled epidemics. They lacked soap. They carried lice. They fell ill. The ideology that claimed mastery over biology collapsed under basic biology. This moral irony did not weaken the regime's cruelty, but it exposed its incompetence. Disease does not obey propaganda. It spreads according to conditions, not beliefs. By 1942, these angles, human breakdown, medical strain, industrial choice, leadership failure, and moral contradiction, were converging. The pressure was building toward a point where the consequences could no longer be contained. That point arrives not gradually, but decisively, when disease stopped the advance. By the winter of 1942 to 43, the German army on the Eastern Front was no longer advancing. It was enduring. At Stalingrad, the collapse would become famous for encirclement and surrender. Less visible, but no less destructive, was the condition of the men inside the pocket. Malnutrition, frostbite, and disease moved together. Lice infestation was nearly universal. Typhus outbreaks surged. Medical units ran out of supplies long before they ran out of patients. Soap had vanished entirely. Field reports from 6th Army medical officers describe men too weak to stand, delirious with fever, unable to hold rifles even when ammunition was available. Evacuation was impossible. Isolation was meaningless in encirclement. Disease spread freely through shared shelters and blankets. Beyond Stalingrad, similar patterns unfolded. In Army Group South, typhus cases spiked during retreats. In Army Group Center, entire battalions were pulled from the line not by Soviet attack, but by quarantine orders. German rail systems, already overloaded, became vectors for infection as sick troops were moved without proper delousing. The numbers told a brutal story. In some periods of 1942, German forces on the Eastern Front reported hundreds of thousands of non-combat casualties due to illness. Typhus alone incapacitated more soldiers than some Soviet offensives. These men did not die dramatically. They disappeared from strength reports. This was the turning point, not because soap itself defeated the Wehrmacht, but because its absence exposed a system that could not sustain prolonged war. Disease multiplied every logistical failure, every delayed supply train, every bombed factory, Every ideological dismissal of medical reality fed the outbreak. Allied intelligence noticed. Captured documents, POW interrogations, and medical assessments revealed rising German disease rates. Allied planners adjusted expectations. Time, they realized, was on their side. The German army had reached a limit, not of courage or weapons, but of bodies. And as 1943 began, the consequences of that limit would reshape the war far beyond a single front, when hygiene became strategy. By mid-1943, the contrast between the opposing forces was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. Allied medical statistics showed a stark pattern. Despite operating in multiple climates, North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, disease rates were controlled, contained, and steadily reduced. Preventive medicine worked. Soap, clean water, enforced bathing, and systematic delousing kept armies functional even under extreme stress. The German army showed the opposite curve. On the Eastern Front, typhus outbreaks forced repeated operational pauses. Entire regiments were flagged as medically unreliable. Commanders delayed movements not for fuel or ammunition, but because too many men were sick to march. The invisible enemy had become a planning factor. German leadership responded with orders rather than supplies. Commands were issued demanding stricter cleanliness. Soldiers were instructed to wash more often, delouse more thoroughly, maintain personal hygiene under impossible conditions. But without soap, without water, without infrastructure, these orders were hollow. Discipline cannot replace material reality. Behind the lines, fear intensified. Medical officers warned that unchecked epidemics could spread westward into the Reich itself. Railway hubs, POW camps, and occupied cities were labeled high-risk zones. Troop movements were restricted. Quarantines multiplied. Each restriction slowed the war machine further. The Allies, by contrast, integrated hygiene into tempo. Invasion plans accounted for sanitation from day one. During the Sicily landings and the push into Italy, mobile bath units followed close behind combat troops. Clothing was rotated. Delousing stations operated continuously. Disease never gained momentum. This difference did not win battles overnight. It won endurance. War had become a contest of sustainability. Germany's early victories relied on speed, but speed without maintenance burns out. Soap, mundane, unglamorous, became a quiet symbol of industrial depth and strategic foresight. By late 1943, German medical services privately acknowledged the truth. They could no longer control disease at scale, not because they lacked knowledge, but because the system no longer supported it. The army was being worn down from within. January 1942, Eastern Front, occupied Soviet territory. The snow does not soften the smell. It sharpens it. Inside a German field hospital near Smolensk, the air hangs heavy with damp wool unwashed skin and sickness that no medicine seems able to stop. Boots line the entrance, frozen stiff. Greatcoats steam faintly as they thaw. Men lie shoulder to shoulder on straw pallets, scratching at skin already raw, eyes glassy not from wounds, but from fever. These soldiers were not hit by artillery. They were not caught in an ambush. They're being consumed slowly, methodically by lice. Typhus moves faster than any tank column. It ignores rank, ideology, and medals. A single infected seam of cloth can incapacitate a battalion. German doctors know the pattern well. High fever, delirium, collapse. But this time there's no buffer. Soap is scarce. Clean water scarcer. Delousing stations are overwhelmed or non-existent. Outside, engines idle. Orders wait. An army built for lightning war stands motionless, weakened not by enemy fire, but by something the planners never truly feared. Because somewhere between ideology and invasion, the most basic weapon of modern war was forgotten, and that oversight will ripple far beyond this frozen room. This internal erosion did not appear on maps. It appeared in hospitals, transport logs, and shrinking unit rosters. And when the Allies began their final advances, they faced an enemy already weakened in ways no photograph could fully capture. The war was turning. What followed would reveal the full cost of that weakness. The cost measured in absence. By 1944, the German army's struggle with disease was no longer a temporary crisis. It was a permanent condition. Manpower reports from the Eastern Front tell a story not of sudden catastrophe, but of steady erosion. Divisions that should have fielded 15,000 men operated with barely half that number. Some losses came from combat. Many more came from sickness. Men evacuated, hospitalized, or left behind during retreats. Typhus remained the most feared, but it was not alone. Dysentery, trench fever, skin infections, and respiratory illnesses compounded the problem. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Chronic lice infestation reopened wounds again and again. Recovery took longer. Relapses were common. Each sick soldier triggered a chain reaction. Evacuation removed transport capacity. Hospitals filled beyond design limits. Medical personnel were reassigned from frontline care to epidemic control. Replacement units arrived already weakened by poor sanitation during transit. The cycle fed itself. German command attempted statistical control. Illness was tracked, categorized, and sometimes minimized in reports. But numbers have weight. By late war estimates, non-combat losses accounted for a staggering portion of German manpower depletion, particularly on the Eastern Front. This loss reshaped operations. Offensives were shortened or canceled. Defensive lines thinned. Units deemed unreliable were pulled back or dissolved. Morale suffered not from fear of battle, but from a sense of physical betrayal. Soldiers felt their bodies failing in ways courage could not fix. Meanwhile, Allied armies advanced with growing confidence, not only in weapons but in stamina. Medical readiness became a quiet advantage. Units stayed in the field longer. Rotation schedules were predictable. Recovery was swift. Soldiers trusted that illness would not be ignored or punished. The difference showed in tempo. As German forces fell back, disease followed them into rail hubs, depots, and cities. Epidemic fears influenced civilian policy and further strained resources. The war at home began to mirror the war at the front. What had started as a logistical oversight became a strategic liability, and the full implications would only become clear once the fighting stopped. Lessons written in medical reports. When the war ended in 1945, the German army lay shattered, not only by defeat, but by exhaustion that had accumulated over years. Post-war medical analyses conducted by Allied authorities revealed the scale of the damage. Disease had not simply accompanied the German collapse. It had accelerated it. In some theaters, illness reduced effective combat strength as decisively as enemy action. Typhus outbreaks alone required massive containment efforts during occupation, confirming how close the epidemics had come to spreading even further. Captured German medical records told a consistent story. Doctors had warned. Supplies had failed. Soap shortages appeared again and again in reports marked urgent. The knowledge existed. The infrastructure did not. Total war had consumed the system that sustained the body. In Allied post-war doctrine, this contrast became foundational. Military medicine was rewritten with prevention at its core. Hygiene was elevated permanently to strategic planning. Soap, water purification, clothing rotation, and delousing were no longer treated as support. They were recognized as force multipliers. The German experience became a case study taught quietly, clinically, without ideology. It showed that an army could possess advanced weapons, disciplined troops, and experienced commanders, and still be undone by neglecting the most basic requirements of human survival. For civilians, the legacy was equally stark. Occupied Europe bore the scars of epidemics spread long after liberation. Camps and ghettos have been reservoirs of disease, not because of nature, but because of policy. The same system that failed its soldiers had inflicted catastrophic conditions on millions of civilians. Soap shortages did not cause Nazi crimes, but they revealed how hollow claims of control and superiority truly were. In the end, the defeat of Nazi Germany was decided by armies, industry, and alliances. But within that vast machinery, smaller truths mattered. An army marches on its stomach, Napoleon once observed. It also marches on clean skin. And when that truth is ignored, no amount of ideology can compensate. That realization leads us to the final reflection, quiet, unsettling, and grounded in the smallest details of war. The quiet weapon. War is often imagined in explosions, gunfire, and the clash of steel. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that it is also fought in quiet, unglamorous spaces, barracks, hospitals, and the unseen movements of disease. The story of the German army on the Eastern Front illustrates this in stark detail. Soap, ordinary, unassuming, emerged as a silent arbiter of strength. It dictated which divisions could endure, which advances would stall, and how morale would hold. Its absence revealed vulnerabilities that no tank, no rifle, and no ideology could conceal. This lesson resonates beyond statistics. It speaks to human fragility. Soldiers, no matter how disciplined or ideologically trained, are bound by physical reality. Epidemics do not negotiate with plans, nor do they yield to belief in superiority. They follow laws of biology, logistics, and preparation. For military historians, the episode redefines what constitutes strategy. Victory is not only measured in territory or casualties, but in the ability to sustain life under duress. Industrial foresight, preventive medicine, and hygiene, mundane in appearance, become weapons in themselves, shaping outcomes as decisively as any battlefield maneuver. And for humanity, the reflection is chilling. A war that consumed millions in combat was also quietly won or lost by the management of bodies and the foresight to care for them. Soap became more than hygiene. It became power. In the end, the narrative leaves a haunting truth. Wars are not won by ideology alone, nor by weapons alone. They are won by those who respect the fragility of life and prepare for the vulnerabilities that no uniform can mask. Even in the vast machinery of global conflict, sometimes the smallest tools decide the fate of empires.